Hello and welcome to the Colts Cover-2 Podcast. I am Joel A. Erickson. I'm joined, as always, by Nate Atkins. We have news. We had news on Monday. Disturbingly close to the start of the national championship game for Nate. But the Colts have a defensive coordinator. It is Lou Anarumo, former Bengals defensive coordinator. We'll just start here, Nate. Your gut reaction to the Colts getting Anarumo.
It's interesting. It was probably about a week ago. I was hanging out with another member of the beat who asked me who my top choice would be. This was James Boyd of The Athletic, and his top choice is Dennis Allen, which I totally get. I think that's a great choice. But my answer was Lou Anarumo. So they have hired the guy I thought was the top of the list. Probably behind the only guy I would say if we could just go out and hire anybody right now, I would take over him was Robert Saleh. I just didn't, he's doing head coaching interviews and he's the top guy on the market. That was a little dreamy, and especially if they're going to make a shift away from stylistically the way that they have been playing defense under Gus Bradley. Robert Saleh is very similar. Lou Anarumo is not similar. Lou Anarumo, most known for the highs. I mean, he's at highs and lows. That's why he's available. But the highs being 2 postseason runs where he was able to trip up Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes 2 different times, even though Mahomes did come back and beat them the one game. But he's been that guy that his next to Steve Spagnuolo, probably best in the AFC, gone out there and befuddled some of the star quarterbacks that run this conference. And that's what happens when he has like a fully loaded arsenal. And that's, I think we'll get to that topic. And he didn't have it last year, and the bottom fell out in Cincinnati. So like any coordinator, there's pros and cons to him, but I just think it's a clear sign that they are serious about getting more aggressive on defense. He's a blitzer, but he's also just aggressive with the way he uses the secondary. They're not going to be nearly as static. I think that's kind of what ended up driving this in the end. Why you would hire Lou Anarumo over other very qualified coordinators is what he is best at is utilizing the secondary players. And that part of it just has not been good enough. And I think it got masked a little bit this year because so many problems on the offensive side of the ball for the Colts, the quarterback situation, the passing game, and then the run defense. But if they had gotten into the playoffs, snuck in it at 9-8, I think that's the conversation we would have been having is they are not – when Chris Ballard talks about they're not close, that's the number 2 area I look at behind their passing game would be their ability to affect and stop high-level quarterbacks. It just isn't good enough on the back end. And so I think Lou Anarumo is a step there's risk to it, but it's a step of chasing that upside of like, hey, we've seen what he can do in a playoff format against an elite quarterback. We want to eventually be that kind of team. And so I think that's the swing they're taking.
Yeah. With Allen, I think some people probably read into, and I don't have any direct information to refute this to reading into it, but just the news broke that the Bears were hiring Ben Johnson. Shortly after that, Adam Schefter said that Dennis Allen was, is likely Ben Johnson's, pick for defensive coordinator. And that part of it, seemed like it happened pretty fast. And then right after that, they hired Anarumo. Like I said, I don't have any knowledge to know whether or not that the Colts wanted Anarumo or wanted Allen. I do know that, if you were paying attention to what the IndyStar wrote, what I wrote, what we said last week, you kind of knew that might be the case, or you should have known that might be the case. Just because, Dennis Allen, like, I get the idea that, like, you just throw a bag at somebody and make sure you close the deal or whatever. But usually in coaching circles, what matters most is, do you get guys that know each other? And I, had heard early on, and it's really not hard to draw the lines. You don't need to hear anything, that Dennis Allen was going to have options. And if you think about it, they're pretty easy lines to draw. Dennis Allen spent 5 years with Dan Campbell in New Orleans. Dan Campbell's coordinators were about to get – Aaron Glenn might be getting a job like as we're doing this. We're taping on Tuesday. I think he's with the Jets today, right? I think.
Yep.
He's with the Jets, and it supposedly that one they're trying to lock him up. If that's the case, that's two guys who have Campbell connections. Aaron Glenn coached with Dennis Allen, and it's not hard to draw it from that to Ben Johnson. So Dennis Allen knew guys elsewhere, so that was always going to be a little bit tougher. Anarumo, I would guess the Colts will say the Colts would if that was the case. We're not going to find out. No one's going to say that. But Anarumo is interesting to me. It's a different profile considerably than Gus Bradley, where like Gus Bradley said flat out to us several times, like, he values simplicity. Lou Anarumo is much more of a game plan defensive coordinator. I've read some stuff from him where he said, he never coached for Bill Belichick or Bill Parcells, but he always saw a lot of wisdom in what they said when it came to if you have when you're going against an offense, you should take away what they do best and make them play left-handed. And that if you're going to do that, that's going to require you to do a bunch of different things and not do the same thing every week. So that's what he's known for. We can get into some of the numbers here. What do you want to do? You want to get into some of the scheme stuff first? Do you want to get into the personnel question?
I think we can start with the scheme stuff because I think that'll lead us into kind of what personnel fits in there. So,
okay. So the most interesting thing to me that I did not know, but poking around, is his blitz rate has actually gone down considerably during his time in Cincinnati. His first couple of years there, they were in the 30s. In 2021, when they went to the Super Bowl, they were at 25%. And then the last couple of years, they've been around 20, 21%, significantly lower in the league. Still higher than Gus Bradley. You're still going to see more blitzes than Gus Bradley did. Bradley was often in the 15 to 17 range. But I wonder if that is, and this is like you said, it's going to get into the personnel piece. I wonder if that's a Jesse Bates thing. Is that a you lost your veterans in the secondary that you could trust? Because if you go back and look at who started for the Bengals during the 2021 season in the secondary, and then go look at who started for them this year, and you can see why maybe you wouldn't want to put those guys on an island as much.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing that you're going to notice with Lou Anarumo. So there's like high highs and low lows in performance, which I guess is, that's the numbers part we'll probably get into as well. But like the highs I mentioned, stumping Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes, how do you go from that to what they did last year when they gave up 43 passing touchdowns, most in the NFL? I think, a lot of that is that drop off in veteran play in the secondary. So you've got Jesse Bates, like you mentioned, superstar, free ranging, free safety. That would be the most important position to how Anarumo designs his defense. That's like the wild card type player. It's similar to Steve Spagnuolo. These are coaches that, unlike many others, they build from the back front. So they Spagnuolo always needs one of those veteran safeties. So the Chiefs went out and they got him Tyrann Mathieu, and then they got him Justin Reed. And the Bengals had Jesse Bates. So they had done the thing that every team wants to do, draft and develop and find a stud. And then they let him walk. And not only him, but they also let Chidobe Awuzie, another very good veteran outside corner, walk in free agency. They try to replace those guys with either kind of like second-rate free agents like Geno Stone, guys that have started, but certainly not a Jesse Bates, or they tried what often has happened here, which is sort of that next man up, draft and develop. And those guys, for whatever reason, have not worked as well. Cam Taylor-Britt, Dax Hill, Jordan Battle, those are guys drafted, second or third round, first round actually for Dax Hill. I don't know. Maybe it was too fast, too soon for them. Like you talk about how Gus Bradley prefers the simplicity of a defense. Part of why he always said that was that allows young players to get on the field and produce faster. They're thinking less. They're using more of their athletic skills. Well, Lou Anarumo is the opposite end of that, where it's supposed to be a complex defense. You're supposed to confuse and trip up, opposing quarterbacks, make it look one way pre-snap, and then a completely different picture post-snap. Well, in order to confuse a really smart quarterback, you have to have really smart, experienced players in the second. Bates, Chidobe Awuzie, I think, covered up a lot with Mike Hilton in the slot that they just couldn't get there without those guys doing the same thing. So that's where you're going to get different takes on Lou Anarumo. I mean, if you want to talk yourself into, that you don't like the hire, all you have to do is look at last year when they gave up 43 passing touchdowns and, they were top 5 in explosive passes given up. And you could say that, he's had a few outlier performances, but those are a few years away. And it's a little herky-jerky kind of defense where it's like they can have a high moment, but they can also get exposed. But if you want to talk yourself into it, again, the case is pretty easy to look at the postseason success. But also you can just make the argument that he needs the right personnel, not just talent-wise, but experience-wise in the secondary to get this done. Because the Bengals, their whole that's the downfall of their defense very much coincided with, they paid Joe Burrow. They know they have to pay Jamar Chase, maybe T. Higgins. And so these free agents they brought in when Joe Burrow was on the rookie contract, they helped get them to the Super Bowl and fit this defense so well, they've let walk. They've let guys like that walk and just draft and develop or get lesser free agents. So they've gone from DJ Reader down to Sheldon Rankins. They've gone from Jesse Bates to Von Bell, or Jesse Bates to Geno Stone, and then those young outside corners in place of Chidobe Awuzie. So I guess that's like the chicken or the egg of it. You could say, well, why does he need to rely so much on personnel? I don't know. In general, that's the league, though, is that there's not a lot of, especially on defense, I feel like, not a lot of coaches who overcome major personnel issues. And so what I wrote yesterday, my first gut instinct was obviously I like the hire. He's my number one choice for this, but they have to complete the deal by going out and getting the experienced players, especially in that secondary, or the issues with the Bengals defense. You look at them last year and they pretty much had one dominant defensive lineman, a young secondary, and they missed a ton of tackles. Does that sound like another defense that you can think
of? Yeah, that's very Indianapolis Colts sounding.
Yeah, so that's the thing is I like the idea of this because I think it's the first step of turning that page of, hey, we're not going to do it the same way. And so this is step one, and step two would be you got to go out. You have to find free agents in the secondary, namely. I think that's just where it's going to have to start. Free safety is the spot, I think, if we went out that personnel conversation. And I haven't looked at the free agent class as much this year. I don't know if they missed their window when they could have gone after some of those guys last year, Xavier McKinney or Justin Simmons or Quandre Diggs. But if they're going to take a swing, which I know is a rare thing for them to do, but if they actually are ready to do that, free safety is the one I think makes the most sense for the coordinator they just hired.
One of the other things that's interesting to me about the difference between Anarumo and, say, Gus Bradley is that Anarumo's defenses – now, this didn't work all the time for him. There's a lot of up and down in the numbers of his defenses. But one of the things that sticks out to me about him is there were 4 times in his 6 years in Cincinnati that they were in the top 11 in completion percentage allowed by opposing quarterbacks. And one year they were first. In 2022, they were first. Colts fans are so used to defenses that just give up completions. Mm-hmm. Going back before Bradley to Matt Eberflus, when you go through the defense completion percentage allowed, the Colts are almost always at the bottom of those tables. Anarumo has a history of doing a better job of forcing incompletions. Now, some of the secondary issues and some of the risks he takes maybe lead to more big plays because yards per attempt doesn't always follow that. But he's not just allowing completions underneath and trying to make tackles based on the statistical profile.
Yeah, just last year. And I mean, this is looking at the worst version of his defense. The Bengals gave up 64.9%. By comparison, the Colts are at 69.4, 5% difference. That may not sound like a lot, but the Bengals were fringe top 10 in completion percentage allowed. Now, the flip side of that is how much that they allowed, explosive plays and whatnot. that did not go so well for them. But yeah, that's the trade-off, is that they're going to make life hard. They're not going to give you easy completions. They are going to risk something in doing that, and that's those explosive plays that just ate them up. They gamble a little bit on the outside, and they'll move guys around, and you can risk a coverage bust that way. So that's where, I'm going to be fascinated to see what happens with this secondary. We kind of dedicated an entire pod to it last time when we just discussed the field, and here we are, and it's like the most important position again for this coordinator. But hey, we're all about that because, again, this is the Cover-2 podcast. So we're literally named after a coverage. Cover-2 is my favorite coverage. To be honest with you, it's a lot better than Cover-0. This is not the Cover-0 pod. I'll leave that to maybe Al Golden. To try and handle. But yeah, it's just super interesting. And that's kind of my gut reaction to it. It could be a good or a bad interesting. We're going to find that out based on just how willing they are to do what Chris Ballard said, which is finish the deal for some of these free agents that they want to go after. So, for example, last year they went after Danielle Hunter and pretty hard, but they didn't get him. And part of that was that he's from Houston. So maybe that always would have been the difference, but there was a little bit more that they could have offered in terms of the guaranteed money to have a better shot at that. That was something that Danielle Hunter wanted, got a fully guaranteed deal. They didn't close the deal on that. And so that's one example. I think the other one Chris Ballard was probably thinking about when he talked about closing the deal was, we know they made an offer to, this is a different side of the ball, but they made the offer to the Giants, revealed on Hard Knocks, to trade up. Again, that's another one where I don't know if they could have ultimately pushed the boulder over the hill there because it's Malik Neighbors and teams weren't ultimately wanting to trade down, but they could try harder. There's just certain things out there, we've talked about this with Matthew Stafford a few years ago. I don't know that they ultimately were going to beat out Sean McVay for him, but they could have tried harder. And so we're going to have to see that on defense this year is they're just going to have to win a bidding war at some point if they're going to want some of these guys that can make a real difference, because I do expect Chris Ballard to sign free agents, but like we talked about, I think on the last podcast or some of these recent ones, I think it has to be more than just competition. I think they have to do signings that's above the, Brandon Faison's going to come in and compete with Jalen Jones type of situation. Because at some point you need guys that you full on trust to be on the field and play every snap at certain positions. And that's not only going to come through competition, it's also going to come through skill sets and talent, proven, developed over the years, a mix of experience and talent. That's what free agency can offer you sometimes in the right moments, the right positions. And the secondary is honestly, they probably should have 3 new starters there next year in the secondary. Bring back obviously Kenny Moore, and then I think you'd feel good enough about Nick Cross entering his contract year after what he just did. But even then, if Lou Anarumo was all about the safety play, if that was everything to him, and if there was a clear upgrade on Nick Cross, I think they should consider that too. They have to complete their deal by giving him the secondary players, or otherwise they're going to risk being what the Bengals were last year on defense.
Yeah, so the definition of competition is interesting because I've had fans bring up I had some fans who because we wrote a story about culture, which one of the things about the way you cover this team is that you write obviously there's 10 things going on with the Colts right now, but we're not going to write about all of them under one big overarching umbrella every time. So one of the stories we were writing was about culture, and Ballard boiled it down to competition. And there were some people who were like, well, competition isn't anything. And like, I think Ballard's definition of competition in the past probably falls under that. If you're just bringing in whoever it seems like it's on the bargain bin, but like actual competition is you sign a starter, and if your young player is better than the starter, oh well. Now the thing is, like, and I tweeted this, or I tweeted a response to Peter Schrager putting this on X Twitter on Sunday. Like, that doesn't mean you have to get these guys. That doesn't mean you have to get guys that are at the top of the market in every position group. And Colts fans should know that. Like, some of their best signings here in the free agent market were not guys at the top of the position group, but they were starting caliber players. Like, I would even throw Rodney McLeod in there. Like, you could get him for not starting money, but he was clearly a starting caliber player. You know what I mean? And so, like, if the idea is by signing if Ballard's definition of competition is signing guys that he views as depth pieces who could start if someone doesn't take a step forward, I don't like that. If he's signing guys who could start to compete with other guys that he thinks could start, that's the good kind of competition.
Well, it's interesting because you brought up Rodney McLeod. I would argue that he initially made that signing thinking it was for a backup. Like, I don't think they trade up to draft Nick Cross, and he got excited and wanted to start him. And from day one in spring, they're starting him. And then they came to find out in training camp, as Rodney McLeod was coming back from a knee injury, they came to find out that Nick Cross was not ready to handle that. Rodney stepped in for that reason, reliable veteran in case this isn't working out. But then he had such a great year. And so sort of a little bit of a chicken or the egg thing. But like financially wise, what they gave Rodney McLeod was in line with a player that you just want a pretty good backup. Again, it was a great signing. I mean, it could do more of those, but they also need to be willing to up the salary amount at some of those positions so that they do it in the reverse order, where this is a starter. And if we happen to draft a third round Nick Cross type, who's a great athlete, but we have to see how he's going to transition, and then he overperforms that guy and takes his job, then cool, that's where we're at. I don't know that they've done a lot of it that way. Since I've gotten here, it's been pretty much like they've identified a couple of players, trade or free agents, that are just, we're signing this guy, he's our starter, and there's really no chance for anybody else to step in there. That was like Yannick Ngakoue and Stephon Gilmore. I don't know that they've done a lot of that sort of, like, you sign a guy who should be a starter, but it's possible that like a second round rookie beats him out.
Well, Ballard, you're right about the money. Ballard didn't give Rodney McLeod any money at all, but like from a standpoint of where he was in his career, it's not like he was a backup coming from Philadelphia. He'd been a starter for 8 seasons or something like that, including in 2021. So the money wasn't there, but like in terms of the quality of player, he was a starting caliber player in the NFL at that time. You've been here for the lightest free agent years. Not to say that he did like way more in the previous years than that, but like you think about, like, you got here in 2021, and then essentially he said, like, basically since those teams, he hasn't done very much, and it has gone down. Like the amount of free agents he signed has gone down. Before that, there were more of them, but they were also, to some degree, a lot of the guys that, like, you think of as, you're signing a starter. Justin Houston, Nico Autry. You trade for DeForest Buckner. Xavier Rhodes was signing a starter. They just haven't, even back then, they weren't necessarily doing a ton of signing guys that they would then draft somebody for. But yeah, I think you need both. I think you need both free agents. Like, if there's a guy out there that can take them to the next level, I mean, the free agent list right now sucks. I'll just put it as bluntly as possible.
There is one super interesting name on it though. And again,
there's good names. I'm not saying there's not good names, but like it thins out fast.
Oh yeah.
It thins out really, really fast. So like
we don't know who's going to get franchise tagged and how that's going to change it, but like, yeah, it thins out. It's not like you're going to, and I don't think they have to necessarily they don't have to go get like 6 starters, but like, I think they should get 2 or 3. And again, you could draft guys who they end up starting, but
I am not letting this podcast turn into Joel doesn't want them to sign free agents, because that's not what I'm saying at all. That's not the argument I'm making. I'm saying they need to do. I'm saying that that signing competition, like you have to raise your level of competition. Like Brandon Faison was not a starter previously before they signed him. He was like a guy who'd been injury replacement. Whereas like the difference with Rodney McLeod is Rodney McLeod was a starter. Like you got him on the cheap, but he was a starter before that for Philadelphia.
Yeah. Well, as I'm looking at this free agent list, it does thin out. I mean, you have just some of these, the names thin out. I mean, Khalil Mack's like one of the higher names on there. But
there are some corners. There is definitely some corners.
There was one very interesting one I just came across. And again, I don't know if franchise tags a possibility with this guy, but Javon Holland.
Yeah. Javon Holland and DJ Reed are the two that I have like marked on my list.
The interesting thing, I just Googled top free agents, and the list is from Pro Football Focus, but they're under Javon Holland, they have as the number 3 free agent. Their top free agent comparison for him was Jesse Bates. So this is kind of interesting.
No, I mean they definitely if there's if that's also, I didn't know this. Pro Football Reference says Javon Holland's nickname is Snowman. So right now, I'm telling you right now on January 21st, that's my number 1 target.
Well, and he also played at Oregon. Another player that Tyler Lewis can get to wear the Ohio State mascot in a bet.
Javon Holland is the kind of player who has a safe, like that's based. I'm looking at like all of his stuff right now, real quick, because I don't know a ton about the Dolphins, but like his coverage numbers the last couple of years have been really good. Which some of that stuff is hard for a safety, but like his yards per target are they're definitely lower than like what the Colts guys gave up this year.
And he would be like
Holland. There are some corners, but I gotta find this list of what Washington did last year. Because there were also signings like that frankly they should have made last year that would have helped them a ton. Where was this? Ertz, Eckler, both of those guys could have helped the Colts.
Mm-hmm.
A guy like Bobby Wagner, like I don't know what the Colts are going to do at linebacker. Ballard has a history of getting, guys in the draft who end up being able to play. Wagner's usually typically a little bit older than he likes to get, but like they need a linebacker, particularly one that tackles well. They also signed Frankie Louvu. Jeremy Chin was on that list. Like some of these guys are guys that weren't necessarily top of the line guys, but they're starting caliber players who ended up being really important for Washington. Like that's the kind of guys I think that they need to mix in with the big signing.
Yeah, that's the thing about it is like there's a lot of guys like this that you could talk yourself out of because there is a reason they got to free agency. It's usually some mix of obviously performance sends guys there, but either age or injuries tend to put a lot of guys there. I think what the Colts often do is they talk themselves into the downside is they're scared of those risks. Well, there's you got to take risks on some of these guys, and that's what the Commanders did. Like Zach Ertz is really old, and so he could have fallen off a cliff, and that may not have worked. But they're going for the idea of that, which is the veteran tight end to help the young quarterback who's won a Super Bowl. Same thing with Bobby Wagner. I mean, it's Bobby Wagner. We don't know how long he has left, and you're talking about a guy who's he's 34 years old now. So if you want to talk yourself out of these guys, like you can do that. But also, that was like that's kind of like a Rodney McLeod, Stephon Gilmore type swing where it's like, well, let's see how much longer he does have this level of play in him. He's a second team All-Pro this year. I just felt like they did that a lot at cornerback, especially. And I remember, to be fair, I mean, we also kind of poo-pooed the cornerback crop last year, but it's because there were a lot.
But we still said sign one. We still said sign one.
We did. We said sign them. If you look at some of these guys, some of them actually really worked out. Akella Weatherspoon was a guy who fit with the Colts deal at outside corner. He ended up starting for the Rams and playing pretty well in the postseason. They're probably not an option for Stephon Gilmore based on what he experienced here. There are some other DBs. A couple of them came in trades, like Marlon Humphrey and Carlton Davis. Carlton Davis, by the way, another guy that's available in this free agent class. Getting a little bit older, but
there's more.
Good. Like
there's more corners than I realized.
Yeah.
There's a few more corners than I realized. Now, are all of them like super high level guys? No, but the thing with corner is that like cornerback in the NFL is probably the most up and down position year over year.
Yeah.
Like outside of the top 7 or 8 guys, you don't get like the same level of play every year. So some of those guys you're going to have to take sometimes you're going to have to take a flyer on a guy and they're going to play back. Like that's what Xavier Rhodes was. Xavier Rhodes was supposedly awful in Minnesota, and the Colts took a flyer on him because they had coaches on staff who knew him, and then he ended up playing really well for them that year. Like you're going to have to do some of that this year in terms of what you do, just to give Anarumo guys who can run the spot, but also to give guys that he knows are going to be on the field.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it, and that's why it's got to rise above competition. You could look at a guy like Travarius Ward. 2023, he was a second team All-Pro, 5 interceptions, led the league in passes deflected. Last year, not the same season. I mean, he's one of those guys that dealt with injuries, played only 12 games, didn't pick off a pass, and so again, you can look at that. I mean, there's a reason the guy gets free agency, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't have anything left. It could be just he had a down year. He had 1 year where he got injured a little bit, but he's like Travarius Ward is 28 years old right now. He'll be 29 next season. Like, I don't know how much that guy has left, but if he has even 1 to 2 really good years left, they need that. So they've got to, and if they sign those guys and they also draft at the position, sign and draft, you give yourself options to where one guy doesn't have to work out for this to be workable. And that's a good comparison for the Rodney McLeod, Nick Cross thing. That was a sign one, draft one. One of them didn't work out, the rookie, but the signing did. Like you don't have to hit on both.
Yep.
You just got to hit one. But when they only give themselves like this guy must be the guy, like Juju Brents must stay healthy and be the guy, or Jalen Jones must figure it all out and raise it. Like there's just not enough options there. And if you don't give Lou Anarumo options, like somebody has to go out there and cover Stephon Diggs when they play the Texans. You don't get to like sit that out. So I don't know. I like that they're going for a secondary based defense. I think that's especially the way Chris Ballard talks about how teams are throwing quick, max protecting. They're finding ways around the pass rush. I think this is a good counter to it, and I think that's what often makes plays in the playoffs is those type of defenses. But again, this has got to only be step one of this process, and I think it extends a few different positions too. Linebacker, I'd find an upgrade on EJ Speed. Like you said, they could draft there, but also They don't have to because of those linebackers, like you mentioned, the Commanders signed. They need better tackle.
Secondary.
A guy who's
the secondary was clearly an emphasis because, with the exception of Martindale, I think with the exception of Martindale, actually I got to look at his positional stuff. But like Dennis Allen was a secondary coach, Steve Wilkes secondary coach, Lou Anarumo defensive backs coach, Ephraim Banda, I said his name wrong, defensive backs coach. Like these guys back, Martindale is the one outlier because he was a linebackers coach, but they were looking for guys who understood the back end, which, duh. Like you should be looking for guys who understand the back end and can help develop those players because you haven't done that very well. Basically the entire time Ballard's been here.
But to actually see him do it is like we always talk about that on this podcast. It's one thing to say, it's another to do it. That's been a test for Chris Ballard in a lot of ways that he has resisted to evolve the past few years. This is not the end of it, like I said, but it is a good first step because he's talked for years about how it's trenches. Got to have 10 defensive linemen. Can't have enough there. Like spend his first round pick on a defensive end. Right after he signed, that's the only starter they've added in free agency the past 2 years is Samson Ebukam. Like that's the one they just put everything into that position. And so I was curious, like, are you actually, he talked about like, we've got to evolve, make life harder on the quarterback. Okay. You got to like put that emphasis into actions and not just, keep doing the same thing. So hiring a coordinator who's based everything from the secondary, that's at least a nice first step.
Yeah. And I think like the Colts don't have Trey Hendrickson. They just don't. There's no edge guy you can point to and go, that guy's Trey Hendrickson. I will say, I mean, you still don't know what you could get with Latu. I'm not going to expect a ton out of Ebukam coming off of an Achilles tear. But like Latu could still make a jump. 4 sacks in his first year is not super like eye popping or anything like that. His pressure numbers were good, but he didn't finish enough. But you can still get a jump. Like if you look at Trey Hendrickson, and this is partially the Saints' fault, but he only had 6.5 sacks his first 3 years, and then he broke out. Again, partially the Saints' fault, but they don't have a top line edge rusher that they can count on like Hendrickson was for the Bengals. That being said, I think the Colts are better than Cincinnati, like the rest of the defensive line. Like they're deeper, they've got more guys there, they've got more options. I think he's working with better options there than they had in Cincinnati. Cincinnati's defensive line is fairly thin. Like Sam Hubbard he's okay,
Yeah.
He hasn't had a defensive tackle there like Buckner. I would say Grover Stewart. Well, I don't even have to like Grover Stewart and DJ Reader. The NFL views them as roughly the same player because they got roughly the same contract in free agency last year. So like, I think the defensive line talent is probably a little bit better than he had in Cincinnati, but and maybe that helps whatever he wants to do. But obviously, Ballard is going to focus on Ballard told us. Well, let me rephrase that. What Ballard said in his postseason press conference that they needed to get better in the secondary, and he said it about linebacker too without saying it. Whether or not that's true 2 months from now remains to be seen because he said some stuff at last year's press conference that didn't end up happening. So
right.
Let's I don't want to count it as truth, but I do think that there's probably a better the depth and overall talent on the defensive line, I think, is better here than it is in Cincinnati at this point.
Yeah, and it should be because it's the number one paid defensive line in the entire NFL. So like that's the one spot they have thrown all their investments into. But yeah, it's that the big test for Ballard, and it's like a lot of these podcasts are going to be us repeating this line, which is, okay, we got to see the action. Like we've heard this before, we got to see the action. That's why I am encouraged by this hire, though, because this was the first step of actually putting something he said there into action. Of we've got to get better in the secondary. We can't just let teams, do the max protect, throw quick, and find those solutions. Well, okay, so what do you do about that? Well, this is a start, which is we're going to change the way we run our defense so it's built with the secondary in mind first and not built so much about, even though Gus Bradley's philosophically was built middle out, kind of linebackers out, which obviously didn't work last year. The way they've structured the roster has been all defensive line's got to just carry this whole thing. I think this could be a good marriage where the defensive line talent is better than Lou Anarumo had in Cincinnati. And so that's like the complement to what he's going to do in the secondary is now you have a pass rush. You have rushers, interior and exterior. If Latu could take a step, you have that with DeForest Buckner. He's never had anything like Buckner on the inside. So whereas they don't have a Trey Hendrickson on the edge, he's never had a Buckner on the inside. So that could be interesting to see the way that plays into it, like quick pressure in the face of a quarterback mixed with disguised coverages and switching the picture post-snap from pre-snap. Like that they're trying to get more turnovers. That could be a good way to do that. But again, like these secondary players are going to have to be able to hold up too. So it's sort of like step one was hiring the coordinator. Step two is they need to balance out their investments on that side of the ball to where it's not like you only pay linebackers and defensive linemen and draft those guys fairly high. They need some more like realistic upside on the back end. Because you think about like where's the upside on the back end? Well, Kenny Moore is a Pro Bowl player, but he's a nickel. So there's a little bit of a limitation on maybe the overall impact of that. Nick Cross, to a degree, you could say athletic profile had that, but realistic upside in his first year as a starter, when you hadn't trusted him to get on the field, that was probably somewhat limited. And he mostly, he delivered, but again, not a ton of upside. Jalen Jones is a 7th round pick. Juju Brent's talent-wise, sure, is a 2nd round pick, but we had to expect that he was going to miss some time. So again, what's the overall relative upside, especially the way that they played those corners? And so then the other one was Julian Blackmon, who looked like that in training camp when he was playing free safety. But again, he often is dealing with some kind of injury that lowers that actual upside and impact, especially when he has to, move positions. And so they've got to get some more shots at like this guy could be the breakout. That's what Trey Hendrickson was when the Bengals signed him. He was a guy who got to free agency off of a 13-sack season in New Orleans. People wondered how much of that was set up by Cam Jordan. Can you do it again? But there's upside because, again, he had done that before, shown that guy in his prime. And then he goes to Cincinnati. He's a tremendous player. They've got to find more of those types, whether it's that type of athletic profile in the draft. Some of the guys we mentioned last week, like Mike Sanderstill and Quinyon Mitchell, the corners they don't tend to like to draft, but they need to be more open-minded to. And it could also happen in free agency of going after a guy like Javon Holland, for example, that like he has star potential. It's going to cost you, and that's what they have to come around on is the cost of this stuff. But they have to give themselves a shot at like they've got to move on past the secondary that's just trying to hang in and survive. Like at some point, that's got to be the engine for Lou Anarumo defense. The way that it was the years that the Bengals got to the AFC title game it was all kind of working in tandem with Trey Hendrickson messing things up front. So they've got the defensive line investments. Now it's just balancing it out. Maybe you let Dio Ademo go in free agency. Maybe who knows if they want to move on from Samson Ebukam just in the spot he's in coming off the Achilles. Like you can still invest in the D-line, but it just can't be the only place you invest anymore.
Yeah, Holland is going to be really interesting because he's going to cost a ton.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that, like you've said, like we keep saying, Ballard's never really signed that guy.
And he's never spent on safety, right?
No
contract dollars.
No, I mean he's barely spent on corner. Honestly, I mean even Gilmore's contract was kind of a steal.
Yeah.
So,
but here's the example for it is last year. I mean, Holland is probably going to be, if he's that top safety on the market guy, clearly above the others. That's where Xavier McKinney was. And
yeah.
Xavier McKinney was signed. Like when that deal went down, we were like, wow, he got crazy money for the market. Didn't really suggest it was such an outlier. 4 years, $67 million. It's an average of almost $17 million a year. But what did they get out of it? They had the NFL. He intercepted 7 passes. He was in the Defensive Player of the Year running and got the Packers to 11 wins. So there's a cost of doing business on some of this, and they just have to be willing to, again, like in Ballard's own words, close the deal. Not only have the interest, but willing to say, okay, it's going to cost what it costs, and it's hard to stomach in the moment, but sometimes you have to bite the bullet to get the thing you have that is essential to getting this whole engine moving. And for Lou Anarumo, I think that's where free safety, that's the swing I think they got to take or try harder.
Yeah, if Bates was that important, then yeah, that's, and it sure seems like Bates was that important to him, just based on everything we've seen from what Bengals people have said and everything like that. Like that's it just feel like free safety. And the other thing is I kind of feel like you look at what they had at strong safety next to Bates is Von Bell. Like I covered Von Bell in New Orleans. He's fine. He's not a difference making type of strong safety. Like there's elements of Von Bell that he started earlier than Nick Cross did, like as a consistent starter in New Orleans, but that had more to do with what they didn't have than like where he was as a player. Like there's elements of Von Bell that I could see in Nick Cross's game. Like I think maybe you could, but you can't do that if you don't have the guy behind him, Like if he's going to play strong, you have to have somebody back there at free who can really play, because Cross struggled in coverage. One of the other things that was interesting, I was reading a story in Anarumo, was there were Bengals players talking about I think it was talking about going against the Chiefs, but I think that it plays larger into like the larger philosophy of Anarumo. They were saying that he was going to take away the middle of the field from them. And now that might expose them a little bit more on the back end, but he knew that's what their offense wanted to do, was go to the middle of the field. I mean, what a difference from what we've seen the last 3 years, where it's just like, you just have it, just take it.
Oh yeah. Well, that's what I'm interested to see is that I am interested to see what they do at linebacker, because I'm sure Zaire Franklin will be back here, but his skill set is not coverage. EJ Speed's a free agent. That's the spot they could shift on. Like it's usually hard to just draft a rookie and trust him as a rookie to cover at linebacker. That is one of the hardest things to find. They kind of found it last year, or maybe at least the skill set of it. Why is his name escaping me? Who's the
Jalen Carlies?
Carlies, yeah, the zoo guy. He's a converted safety, moved down to linebacker. That was his skill set, and it's not proven though. Like they're going to have to get somebody who can cover a linebacker to make this thing work too. So that might be an area. I haven't looked through the free agents, but that's like if there's a guy who can do that, and even it may have some of this. Maybe there's a little injury concern, or maybe he's a little. Maybe he's getting a little bit older, whatever the reason is that got him there. At some point, they're going to have to stomach some of that potential downside to get the assurance that, or to get a guy in there who has the chance to do it because he's done it before. And then that's maybe where you could have Jalen Carlies in the mix. He's the young player behind a veteran. There's 2 options there. One of them needs to end up being your cover linebacker. But I do think the linebacker, like as time played out, that just became such a problem on third downs, as teams knew they could just pick at the linebackers in coverage. And they couldn't really do much about that. They just gave up the middle of the field that way, which safety plays into that too. I mean, maybe you can get by at linebacker a little bit better if you have a Javon Holland, wrecking things, and the way that Tyrann Mathieu really helped out linebackers in Kansas City. That's where you make one of those huge purchases, it could have ripple effects to help these other guys out to where they have better seasons. It's not all about just him being the only guy to bring that impact. So that's why I think this needs to be the year for it. I think free agency makes more sense on defense this year than offense, just based on the strengths of the draft, but also based on what they're trying to get out of, like what they're trying to give to their specific play caller on each side of the ball. I don't think they can just draft answers on defense this year. I don't think that's going to work, because a big part of the reason the Bengals went downhill is they got young. They didn't have the secondary tools, and their tackling wasn't up to par as a result of kind of all that changes too. So they don't want to just repeat what the Bengals did.
The Bengals line he said Jermaine Pratt has been his weak side linebacker, and it looks like generally more of the cover linebacker for him previously. Logan Wilson is the guy who plays the middle, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wouldn't bring back EJ Speed. Just wouldn't.
No.
Nope.
No, I mean, there's just like, I think what good GMs do too is that when you have a chance to upgrade, you should take it. Like anywhere in the roster, maybe not as a blanket statement, but in general, that you should be looking to find those areas, even if you have and I wouldn't even put EJ here, but if you have some free agents, let's say Julian Blackmon's probably like this. That's like, he could work. He's done some good stuff. It could work, but you could also do better. Like Javon Holland would be a clear upgrade. And I think if you find all the teams that do well, they find a position or two that at some point they just want to upgrade. It's not that guy's a problem. They want to upgrade. That's what the Lions did, going from Jamal Williams to David Montgomery. And I think this team too often is like the whole idea of we like our guys. It's that, well, he's been good enough. And then you're hoping he takes a step. Whereas like you could just go pay for that step. You could pay for the guy that's already done that step in the league, which is a lot of guys we've mentioned here that have been on this list. So yeah, it's kind of the table for them to go into free agency and do some things.
We have to wait for that because it's January 21st, so we got to wait 6 weeks. 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
But we get to talk to Lou Anarumo on Thursday this week. We were taping this on Tuesday. We get him on Thursday. I did not look it up before the podcast, so I blame myself for this. But in my head, I don't think we talked to Gus Bradley until well after the hire.
There was a gap. We did get him in person, but I do think we had to wait on it a little bit.
Yeah, I think we waited a little bit longer before we got him. So I'm excited. I'm excited to talk to Lou Anarumo. Ask him what he thought went wrong, what went south in Cincinnati for him. I ask him why his blitz numbers have gone down. Some of that stuff. I just love to get the chance to talk to him, get some stuff out there. Just from on the defensive coordinator, like you said, it's a first step, and it'll be a different scheme. It's going to be a different focus on the scheme, different way of thinking about it. But there's also the element of it that. So what are you going to do beyond just the coordinator? Like it can't obviously it can't just be a coordinator thing, especially after you spent the last 2 years saying you didn't give Gus Bradley enough in the secondary. I was texting with somebody in the league about just defenses and stuff the other day, and like we were going through the candidates or whatever, and like part of it came down to like all of these guys need corners because every defensive coordinator needs corners.
Mm-hmm. But like we said, there are some names in free agency. It's better than it was last year, and I even say last year, like we go through this list, there were answers that playoff teams found. This year, there's a lot of guys that you just go through here in the secondary. Well, like we just go down the list and you see Javon Holland and you see DJ Reed. Some of the other guys those are some of the guys at the top, but even like Carlton Davis, is kind of an interesting player there. Asante Samuel Jr., like some of these players, like, again, same thing we already talked about. You can talk yourself out of them if you want, but you also need to talk yourself into some guys. And the playoff team.
What they didn't do at corner last year is it's really looks more and more egregious the further we get away from it, because at corner, it wasn't just that they didn't sign free agents. They also didn't draft anybody until it was too late. And like we went through on the last podcast, a ton of those guys ended up being like real players for their teams. So what they didn't do at corner last year, just more and more damning every time you look at it, really.
Well, again, we talk about finding upgrades. They came out of last year where not only was the secondary not that good, but it had injury concerns. And so you looked at a guy like they're bringing back Dallas Flowers off the Achilles tear. Like, that is a very clear area to upgrade. And if they just looked at it that way, they upgraded that spot, it's still possible that Juju Brents could have stayed healthy. You let it play out and see. And then maybe that guy you signed is instead the number 3. Well, if that was the case, if they had a much better number 3 than Dallas Flowers, they would have been in a better spot. Like, it's just the lack of options, the lack of, like Ballard said, fresh blood. It's just like all they could do last year in the secondary was hope and pray that they don't get too injured and that they're at best average. And like, they need to give themselves chances to be like something really good. And that's what, and it may not work, but you gotta take some swings in ways that I just think like the lack of upside at so many of these positions that just became really glaring to where, like, as we talked about, the defensive line had to bring all the upside. So then you lose Samson Ebukam, and Laiatu Latu's not quite, the just day one difference maker because he's a rookie. And all of a sudden I know Ballard said they played pretty well. I think they played fine, but they weren't like, they were built and paid to be like the 2015 Denver Broncos front with the way that they set up the rest of this defense. And that's like, you need to hold like all 3 levels to have some upside. And so that's what they've got to find at linebacker and in the secondary this year.
Yeah. Yeah. You just, you think about like what the line, like, I know the Lions just lost, but you think like you think about what the Lions did last year. They had a hole at corner. So they signed and drafted. The Eagles didn't sign anybody at corner, but they drafted and drafted and drafted. Like those teams didn't just add one guy. Like they added multiple options. They added multiple options, and that's he said we've got to be better in the secondary at corner and safety. Yeah, we've got to be better. Like it's going to take a pretty big overhaul.
Yeah, because we got to be better can't be the guys we have to just get better.
Right.
Because again, is it possible? Again, though, it's more possible. It can still happen that way. Like, you sign a good outside corner, then maybe that pushes Juju Brents, and then he stays healthy and he has this breakout, and then he starts over him, and then you have a really good number 3 corner. That's the veteran. Or maybe he's the number 2, and now Jalen Jones is your number 3, which is pretty good for number 3. That's the trickle down effect. That's like how I think the building the competition, as we've already laid out, needs to look more like it just creates this trickle down effect where like it's kind of like raising all the boats. And instead of like, you're just gonna, it's not just pushing a guy, but it's also setting up your depth chart to where like you could hit upside at a lot of different levels, and that's fun. And that's what the Bengals ultimately hit with Lou Anarumo when they hit their ceiling. It was a mix of some drafted players that turned out pretty well, like Jesse Bates. They drafted a couple stars like that, but they and Logan Wilson, but they supplemented it with the Trey Hendrickson, Von Bell, Chidobe Awuzie type signings that like all of a sudden like the whole roster is just that much stronger, and you're not banking on just all these guys staying healthy. And then the best case scenario of that is still at best a league average unit. Like, that chase upside, and that's draft and develop, or draft and sign, I think.
Yep. We'll have more on Anarumo after we get a chance to talk to him. Probably not this week. We're probably not going to tape it on Friday or anything like that. But it'll be interesting to hear from him. Specifically, forgot Eli Apple was there. That's a wild name to think about.
Yeah, that is one of the free agent signings that didn't work as well.
Eli Apple, what a character.
Yeah.
But yeah, sorry, I was looking at their 2022 personnel. Yeah, it's Anarumo is, I think Anarumo, I'd sum it up this way. Anarumo is well regarded, but like a lot of defensive coordinators around the league, he's got to have talent. And with the exception of like maybe one or two guys, I think that's true everywhere. Like if you look at the rest of the guys on that they interviewed, like Wink Martindale, who blitzes like crazy. Wink Martindale had incredible defenses in Baltimore for 3 years, and then they got bad at corner. The defense got bad. When he went to the Giants, he had some moments, but his numbers weren't good because the talent was bad. Dennis Allen, he built the Saints defense into something, but when he first got there, they didn't run nearly as good of numbers because they didn't have the players yet. Wilkes' story is weird because you have the most recent thing we saw in the NFL is that he was with the 49ers, but it wasn't his scheme, which like it just throws off the whole thing. Because they were asking him to run somebody else's scheme, which is just a weird thing to do. But like, I mean, is there any coordinator in the NFL who's defensive coordinator in the NFL who you're like, this guy's going to be successful no matter who the personnel is? Like even Fangio?
No, because Fangio didn't work in Miami just a year ago. And then he went to Philly and took over a talented roster, but they didn't just say, oh, Fangio's here, we're done and we're fixed. Like they went out, they spent those 2 second-round picks on cornerbacks, and then they also signed Bryce Huff and they signed CJ Gardner-Johnson. That's a ton more than Colts ever do, and that's with a great coordinator. But the reasons they're like, you're a great coordinator, it's just different philosophy. Their idea is like, you're a great coordinator, so we're going to give you more to work with that you can then build something great with, rather than the idea being you're a great coordinator, so save us. Because, I think across the NFL, the ones that have done this and worked, a guy like Brian Flores, they went out and signed Stephon Gilmore for him this year. They had to lose Daniil Hunter, so like he did a great job there, but they didn't just like promote the next guy. They signed Jonathan Grenard to not
who had a really good year.
And they had a great year there. So like, I'd actually say like Fangio's career is actually the perfect example. There's some bad defenses he's coached, including here in Indy, when the talent fell apart. But when the talent's been really good, when the investments have been good in San Francisco and Chicago and now Philadelphia, you see that like he can hit that super high ceiling. Lou Anarumo's career is for a much shorter span in just one place, but the highs and lows I think very much correspond with, did you have the difference-making defenders, or did your front office let them walk?
Even a guy like Spagnuolo, like Spagnuolo's at the point now where his defensive coordinator resume is as good as it gets. Like that dude's got rings, and he's taken down some big-time guys. But like he also has a year with the Saints when they set the league record for most passing yards allowed because they were terrible. They had terrible personnel. Like I can't think of a coordinator who you're like, well, if you just bring in this defensive coordinator, he'll fix it all. I don't think that exists.
Well, and with Spagnuolo, again, same thing with like the Eagles of Fangio. They add to his aggressiveness. They didn't just say, well, Spagnuolo's here, so we're done. They went out, they signed Tyrann Mathieu. And then when he left, they signed Justin Reed. And they've done it that way. And then like they also didn't say, well, we have Spagnuolo, so we can let Chris Jones walk. They found a way to like, we're locking Chris Jones in here. And so like it's just that total difference philosophy. It's like what the 49ers do on offense with Kyle Shanahan. It's like Kyle Shanahan's an amazing play designer, so they want to give him more to work with. They go out, they trade for Christian McCaffrey, they draft Brandon Ayuk. Like the more you give these guys, then you see them really hit a ceiling. When Vic Fangio, he arrived in Chicago, and I was there in 2015. He raised the floor of that defense from like the worst in the history of the Bears to about a league average unit. But then when they got specials, when they went out and traded for Khalil Mack. So it's like you've got to add those difference making guys, and especially it's the positions that tend to define that scheme. Which for Lou Anarumo, I think is free safety. So like we have a fairly easy one there, but like the safety position, same for Steve Spagnuolo, and that's what the Chiefs go after all the time. So yeah, they've got a shot here to remake this. I don't think this defense is that far away from being a good unit again. So long as if you tell me that they could get like a difference making free safety and at least start like a little bit better starting caliber veteran corners, then they're not that far off. One linebacker who can cover. It's a lot.
Don't forget the tackle part.
What's that?
I said end tackle. Don't forget the tackle part.
Yeah, they got to be able to tackle again.
He's got to be able to cover, and he's got to be able to tackle. EJ Speed didn't do either.
It's hard to be a good defense if you don't do those two things. Which is what Lou ran into last year. So there's an obvious downside case that they also have to avoid here.
Yep. We'll see what they do. Like I said, we unfortunately have to wait like 6 weeks for it. We don't have to wait to talk to Lou Anarumo. We'll do that on Thursday. We'll probably have some thoughts on what he says. Like I said, probably not this weekend, maybe next week. For the Colts Cover-2 Podcast, I'm Joel Erickson. This is Nate Atkins. You guys get excited about Lou Anarumo's comments on Thursday.